what U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo tried to do yesterday when he went to the UN and he said he wanted the world to punish and sanction or re-sanction Iran. And the tool that he wanted to use to punish Iran, and he made it very clear, this is why we're doing this, is the treaty that was signed by Iran and the United States during the Obama administration, the one that the Trump administration scrapped. They got rid of it. So here's the news then. Pompeo's request was met yesterday when he took this argument to the United Nations. They almost laughed at him. I mean, what he got essentially was a laughable no, if not a hell no. Russia, China, Britain, France, and virtually every other UN Council member country told Pompeo that the U.S. does not have the right to quote a treaty and try and use it if you scrapped that treaty. They say he lost that right when essentially the United States reneged on the Iran nuke deal. This is fascinating, isn't it? Pompeo, for his part, is reportedly extremely angry about this, and he's not taking the rebuke well. He's very angry. He said particularly angry with Russia for trying to call a meeting. He feels like they kind of let him down for not siding with him. However, he reserved his most public insult for the EU, who he is accusing of, quote, direct quote, siding with the Ayatollahs. He says the EU is siding with the Ayatollahs. So what is to be made from this international rebuke? How rare is it for a Security Council members of the United Nations to just roundly rebuke a U.S. proposal while they're seemingly holding their nose at the proposal itself? You know, I just had no idea that it would be so roundly rebuked as apparently it has. Jim, you're a diplomat. Let me start with you. How often does the the United States take something to the UN and have what seems like the entire committee there hold their nose at the U.S.'s proposal?
It doesn't happen all that often. After all, we own so many countries in the United Nations that are not really fully sovereign states. But on this one, where we really don't have a leg to stand on, where, as you say, we pulled out of the deal. It's not exactly a treaty technically, but you're right. I mean, we're out of it. Mm-hmm. And the idea that we then can enforce rights under it is simply absurd. The Europeans, even, that's too much for them. Although we'll have to see now what kind of arm twisting and threatening Mr. Pompeo is going to engage in.
George, what do you make of not just what happened, the fact that essentially the UN said to Pompeo, no way, but that then Pompeo went and said that the EU is siding with the Ayatollahs and publicly showed his displeasure with Russia as well. What do you make of that?
Well, it all would be funny if it weren't so tragic. As you brilliantly summed it up at the beginning, it's very funny. The Security Council almost laughed the United States out of court. It's funny in a ridiculous way, but it's also very tragic because, of course, it widens the gap already quite palpable between the United States' historic traditional allies on the European continent, in the European Union. It doesn't get much more insulting than to say to sovereign European countries that they are somehow tools or fools of the Ayatollahs. Really? Do you really mean that? And the Iranian people are already under devastating economic sanctions unilaterally imposed by the United States. The US was trying to get other countries to instate sanctions on Iran that the US is already putting on them and forcing others by arm twisting, finger breaking, all the tactics of the Sopranos to force other people to do it. So the Iranian people go on suffering. The Europeans are insulted. America is diminished. That's not good, Rick. Not good at all.
Diminished is a strong word, Jim. Do you agree? Do you think this kind of thing where you overreach, that's my word, not yours, has a diminishing effect long range for the United States?
It does, and I suppose if these people had any sense of shame, they would feel shamed. But I think what they simply do is go back to the drawing board, and as George said, they'll start breaking fingers and do the things they usually do. I mean, look at the way, for example, they've treated like the Nord Stream 2 deal between Russia and Germany. They simply start sanctioning companies, and that's what they'll start doing here. And look, let's be clear: the Europeans may be saying no at this point, but let's remember how they folded like a house of cards when they said, "Oh, we're going to set up this special transaction vehicle so we can still do business with Iran," and then Washington barked at them, and they all fell apart like the pack of cowards they are.
Can you make an argument, George, to give the benefit of the doubt to my country, that there should be some kind of sanctions against Iran, and that they should execute that right now?
I really don't. Iran hasn't invaded anybody else in 300 years. It's not Iran that sponsors terrorism around the world. It's Saudi Arabia, with whom your country and my country are the very best of friends. And even the chopping up of a Washington Post columnist didn't make any difference to that. No, look, if there are issues with Iran, and I have some, with Iran in Iraq, for example, as I indicated to you yesterday, it's far better, you know, to deal with these things diplomatically. War is infinitely less preferable than jaw. And these economic sanctions, which effectively are a siege, are the financial and economic equivalent of war. And they're getting nowhere. The United States is losing it. So it really would be better to go back to first principles. And I hope if Trump is reelected in November that he will do that.
Let me ask you the question, Jim, the way I think it would be posed if I worked for the Trump administration or if I worked for Mike Pompeo. And what he would say to you, Jim Jatras, would be something like this. Why do you expect us to sit and deal with the #1 sponsors of terrorism in the entire world, who we believe are on the brink of having a nuclear bomb? Why should we talk to those people, Jim Jatras?
Well, I think the short answer would be, if any of that were true, which it's not, as George has pointed out, still in that case, you're better off negotiating than pushing the world to the brink of war. Let's remember, back during the first Cold War with the Soviet Union, when they had a communist ideology, we had a very unpleasant relationship with Maoist China. Is it still better to go to war with the country just because they have an ideology that we don't like? And that's essentially what we're talking about here. This really, it has to be put into the basket of things like Iraq and Serbia in the 1990s or Venezuela, where we think that it's a relatively small country and we can kick them around as long as we have some other window dressing on our side. We just can't take no for an answer.
What do you think will happen with Pompeo at this point? George suggested that he would turn the screws a little tighter. Do you think they're going to do that? Or will they drop it, especially considering that we're in the middle of a pandemic, my gosh?
A pandemic and a pre-election period. These two things ought to have Donald Trump's administration concentrating on the home front. But Jim's right. The European Union governments frequently fold like a cheap tent. They may do again this time. But it's like the straw being loaded on the camel's back, Rick. Eventually, the last straw will be there, and the back will break. And I think Europe is close to breaking point so far as the United States administration is concerned.